Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janice Robinson, Vice President for Diversity and Community Affairs at Teachers College, Associate Professor of Higher Education, and I am TC's Title IX Coordinator as well. I just want to thank you for joining us for this timely and important discussion. Education moving forward, anti-LGBTQIA+, policies and current curricular practices. We are pleased to co-sponsor this program with Go Lead, which is TC's Global Observatory of LGBTQ education. Last year, we hosted an inaugural lecture to highlight the incredible work that Go Lead was taking on, particularly discussing how they planned to create a central resource hub to support educators, decision makers, knowledge brokers, specialists, and the general public to support LGBTQ+ youth. We are pleased to collaborate again with Professor Oren Pizmony-Levy to continue the conversation about education, inclusivity, and equity for the LGBTQIA+ community. In framing this conversation, we will hear from Dr. Sandra Schmidt, Associate Professor of Social Studies Education and the Program Director in Social Studies Education at TC. Professor Schmidt will discuss her work related to LGBTQ inclusive curricular practices in the era of anti-LGBTQIA+ policies. I will invite Professor Pizmony-Levy to give a brief welcome on behalf of Go Lead and introduce Professor Schmidt. But before doing so, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Pride Month. During this month, we celebrate freedom, equity, inclusivity. Additionally, we shed light on the history of discrimination and hate in our community and what we have faced. We also take this time to celebrate the progress we've made in our society and are reminded that the fight for a more equitable and inclusive world absolutely continues. This work is not limited to a month of acknowledgement. We must be vigilant in our efforts to break down these barriers and hate every day. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Oren Pizmony-Levy, but I'd like to share his brief bio. He's Associate Professor of International and Comparative Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. His scholarship centers on the intersection of education and social movements. Specifically, he's interested in the emergence of movements that challenge schools and education systems worldwide, the role of both transnational and domestic actors in the development of these movements, and the intended and unintended consequences of the movements. Much of his work focuses on three educational movements: international assessment of student achievement, educational and sustainability education, and sexual orientation and gender identity. His recent work examines the global diffusion Teach for America and Teach for All, and the opt-out movement in the United States. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my good colleague, Oren Pizmony-Levy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon if you are in New York City or in the East Coast, and good evening or whatever it is where you are. I'm excited to work again with Janice and her fantastic team, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for hosting these events year after year, even during the pandemic, which is not something that I take for granted. So thank you so much, Janice, Juan Carlos, Janelle, Melissa, and the team. I have the honor to introduce my colleague, Sandra Schmidt, and I will read a quick bio about her, and will also give you some fun facts about Sandra. Sandra, are you ready? So Professor Schmidt, as Jenny said, is an Associate Professor of Social Studies, Education at Teachers College. She's also the Program Director there. She received her bachelor's degree in Political Science, Economics, and Women's Studies from Swarthmore College, her MA in Curriculum and Instruction from University of Michigan, where she also received her PhD in Teacher Education. Prior to obtaining her PhD, she worked on education initiatives in Malawi, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, and taught secondary social studies within the US. Her research, which I find fabulous, and I encourage everybody to check out her publications. Her research interests include geography education, critical social theory and geography, civic education, social studies education, post-colonial theory, gender and queer theory. Her recent publications have been focused on queer theory and global social studies education. Student of mine who worked with Sandra says wonderful things about classes on spatial analysis. So if you're interested in that. And fun fact about Sandra Schmidt, I owe her my marriage. Sandra organized an ARA panel in 2012 where I met my husband, Professor Noach Dresner from the Higher Post-Secondary Education. Sandra didn't know us, but she put us together on a panel. 10 years after, we are happily married at the same college with a baby. So thank you, Sandra, for your intellectual contribution, but for everything you did for me personally. So without further ado, Sandra, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for that introduction, Oren. And I love the fun fact. I love that is, I take great pride in that, although I did not know all of you at the time. It was so wonderful, kind of the union that came out of that fabulous panel. So I'm going to actually do a little screen share here to present some of this work. I've been asked today to think a little bit and share with you kind of some of the work that I've been doing around inclusive curricula. My work works with both young people as well as teachers who are doing the work of inclusive practices. And I intentionally kind of left off the Q and the plus when I titled this slide, because I think it's worth, as we talk today, and I know people really want to talk about the kind of current bans that are happening LGBTQ youth in schools. And I want to think very seriously though about what the language of those policies does say and doesn't say, and that the word queer is often missing. And one of the things that I want to propose today is that one of the things about using queerness is that the queerness, the opportunity that queer is missing might become part of the work of the subversive work that we continue to do, and how we might utilize that in this work. So I'm going to start with three kind of images from current research. And there's a number, as Oren mentioned, I'm working on a number of different projects right now, some working with teachers, some working with young people, and some looking at policy. So I'm going to kind of share these with kind of three recent works and kind of explain why each of these is here. But each of these for me reflects what one of the things I want to really emphasize of what part of the culture is that we're talking about right now. And I think there's a lot more news about the anti-LGBTQ policies. But there's a lot of stuff happening I think is worth noting. So this picture is a picture I took along the Hudson River Greenway, and it's in Midtown across from, it's like 12th Avenue, I think like 44th Street, and I forget the street number. But one of the things I think interesting about this billboard is it places this very kind of uncontested statement into the space of the city. As a social text, it reminds us about the spatiality of citizens, of gender, of sexuality. And the billboard circulates a kind of a socio-political message about queerness within a commercial and tourist area. I think it's worth noting kind of where this is located. It demands attention, and its message, celebrating and possibly normalizing youth, acts on those who gaze up. The billboard is significant kind of in this moment as a reminder to tourists visiting from these places, and kind of sends a very strong political message through its use of space. I'm going to share this quick TikTok video. Hopefully this will come through. Good. When I'm super bad, man, I know that pussy good. Good. When I'm super bad, man, I know that pussy good. Sorry, let me make TikTok stop playing. That works. So in other work using TikTok, I use the work of a TikTok creator named Viandre. And Viandre is really important in disrupting this this trans logic that is imposed upon. And I think this TikTok in particular was one that I focus on a lot because of the various ways in which it utilizes various kind of uses, the predatory language, the predatory music, kind of the way in which the music itself signifies girl through her genitalia and through this rape culture that's part of this, But then set aside from that is her playful smile and dancing, and the dress that belie the possibility that she might be read as a predator. And in this work, there's a comment, one of the commenters writes, "But can you imagine how confused people would be if you walked into the men's room?" And so kind of really pushing back at this language and discourse that's happening. And so she takes up in her TikTok, she often takes up these pervasive political cultures that are happening in the world around us and directly confronts them through the ways in which she possesses and presents her own body and her own identity. This third is a quote Judith Butler has been publishing a number of times this year in The Guardian. And in her most recent piece, she wrote a lot about what is provoking this backlash around gender. And she writes that reactionaries perceive gender as a dangerous, if not diabolical, ideology threatening to destroy families, local culture, civilization, and even man himself. She reminds us very importantly of the very kind of material consequence of this reactionariness. There's now trans-free spaces in Poland. Trans youth, as we know, in the United States are prevented from entering bathrooms, athletic teams. LGBTQ refugees in Kikuma refugee camp in Kenya hunker together to keep vigilant watches to protect their bodies. So queer resides then in this kind of complex cartography of these material artifacts that perform queer. We have in here these bodies that are confronting gender and sex binaries, that confront the closed match to those bodies. They receive and confront oppressive rhetoric and policies that seek to erase queerness and other homonormative discourses. They play with queer space. And we see this happening alongside. We have this reactionary, and then we also have young people and teachers who are doing the work to confront. And I think it's worth holding those into conversation. So what I want to think about today is just that, is this kind of, what is this reactionary oppressor language that we're hearing in these recent laws? What are these simultaneous inclusive LGBT mandates? And then I want to think about staying with queer by looking at the specific work about queer history and youth are doing today. So very quickly, I wanted to share these two kind of maps from an organization, kind of this mapping LGBTQ rights, because I think it's important as we talk about where policies do not exist, to also pay attention to where policies do exist. And so as I look at this map, I think our attention is drawn. I mean, obviously half of the country is untagged, which means they have no laws protecting LGBTQ students. We notice that in the dark green states and the more green states are ones that have specific protections around trans students, around sexual orientation, around gender identity. And the kind of cautionary sites are the kind of the most damaging, where there are states that actually prevent trans students from using school facilities consistent with their gender identity. But we see quite an array. We focus a lot on those states that are kind of more orange and are targeted, but we also have a lot of this kind of this work in green about states leading the way. And I think we need to continue to talk about what those states are doing as we focus on the anti-LGBT rhetoric and conversations. Relatedly then around curriculum, we've been hearing a lot about Florida's Don't Say Gay bill and the number of states that have subsequently adopted or have proposed that. 6 states have already signed that into legislation. But we also have 7 states that explicitly mandate LGBTQ inclusion in state curriculum standards. We have additional states like Maryland and Massachusetts that don't have a law on the book, but they have included them. They've included LGBTQ history across their curricular framework, even if it's not legally mandated by the state legislature. So these two things are kind of coexisting, and we get a lot of attention right now and need to focus a lot of attention on what's happening in the states that are in orange. But I also want to take the stories from the states that are in green and think about what is it, how can we have these parallel discourses so that we don't get kind of caught in a trap where in our goals to resist and react, we don't continue to produce and create queerness. And I think that's part of what I think is also potentially lost in this work. So very briefly, the 2 laws that these are just 2 examples of laws. The FAIR Act in California the FAIR Act in California is the first to have LGBTQ history and mandates this inclusion and talks about, I want to kind of focus on this language that specifically mentions men and women. So it's interesting to have this statement about the contributions of men and women alongside the inclusions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans, kind of simultaneously setting up a gender binary and simultaneously questioning that gender binary. But I think it's worth paying attention to the language that is in these curricula that they are and are not using as we make sure that we are inclusive around gender and sexuality. So in terms of meeting those kinds of standards, a lot of the teachers that I work with in my study are really doing a lot of work that I would call kind of an inclusive history approach. And an inclusive history approach, I give some examples here, is really an opportunity to think about what is LGBT, in this case, content. And to do this, the most common approaches are to locate LGBT people and events in history. This often means locating people, perhaps they've been closeted, we can then assign as gay. So this is very common and a very important kind of contribution that's been happening, and new people, events are making their way in. The teacher that I cite here on this page is talking a lot about the strategies and how they use activist teaching, using Keith Haring's work to really show students not just kind of the LGBTQ history, but also to demonstrate the principles of activism that cut across time and are generative to young people today who might be fighting similar fights today. So they look at these strategies, so they're learning kind of LGBT content as well as activist strategies that extend more broadly to their lives. And so figures like Bayard Rustin, Alan Turing begin to get their place in classrooms. Their presence, their identity as gayness become very important. But I also want to point out that one of the challenges about inclusion and why we need to do more is this also keeps us kind of situated in what we might call straight time, where we think about a progressive accumulation of rights. And we think about stories of queerness that don't necessarily kind of complicate the gender and sexual variance that is also part of our history. So furthermore, one of the things I want to think about is the way in which gay is a relatively modern and Western term. So what that means is that we're looking across the globe, we're looking prior to 1869, what is the language, who are we looking for? What are we excavating from the archives when we don't have the language to ascribe? We're looking across the globe when we realize that gay is a certain kind of Western political terminology. So how do we excavate queerness across the globe in an LGBT framework that is most of these state mandates? So two of the people I call upon a lot are Jose Munoz and Sarah Ahmad, who I've cited here. And one of the things that Jose Munoz was trying to bring to us was the idea of thinking about futurities and thinking about the ways in which we might kind of glimpse the future through the work that we're doing today, in an ongoing critique that in some ways we are leaving the future not queer, that we're leaving the present not queer enough to imagine a queer future, that we're becoming very inundated with kind of a normalization of queerness, that we begin to stop imagining the excess that might generate a queer future. And also kind of to cite the work of Sarah Ahmad and thinking about this notion that she calls straight time and the detours that we might need along the way, rather than creating these progressive and linear ways that we walk through time and space. So as a brief example of that, I've just kind of shared really quick glimpses into this work, and I'm happy to talk more. But as a really quick example of that, here's an example of a teacher. They talk about this is the work that they're doing kind of in ancient history and saying, well, we don't have gender and sexuality across ancient history. And of course, this teacher's work says, no, that's exactly what we do. Every culture has queers, every culture has gender non-conforming people in particular spaces. And this is then the work that he does across his classrooms by investigating the few sources that we do have from the ancient world to really begin to talk about and disrupt the languages. And some of these, I argue, are very approachable even within the work that is happening in California. So the examining the idea of a woman king and what does it mean to have a woman king and what does it mean to assign gender to king and queen roles in ancient history is a very provocative way to not say gay, but still do the work of beginning to question how the gender binaries are built and how gender roles and gender identities are assigned and ascribed onto roles, positions, and bodies. Another example of this work then is looking at kind of this work in some of these examples from modern US history. And I emphasize modern here because once we get into the 18 and 1900s, we begin to change the discourse in the history because we now have people and moments that are more recognizable through the languages of homosexuality, through the language of gay. So we have different languages that have arisen. So, but these teachers are also still trying to think about a queer history, ways in which we might kind of just using this to kind of think about disruption, to pay attention to the ways in which normalizing practices come to exist and to function. So for example, Teacher C uses this work in a book called Beloved Sisters and Loving Friends, which is a collection of letters between Addie and Rebecca, two women living in the Northeast in the 1850s and 1860s. And in his classroom, they really analyze these stories and what are these notions of desire? What does desire look like? How does desire define our relationships and what role do they play? What does a friendship look like? And the whole point of his opportunity is not to label, in this case, the women as lesbian, but to ask this question as they wrestle with what does it mean to be in love with a woman and have these expressions of love and desire toward a female friend, and also be expected socially to marry a man. And so there's this heterosexual marriage and this intimacy amongst women that kind of produce kind of a parallel understanding, right? In a framework, in a modern contemporary framework around sexuality, it doesn't fit in a clearly defined space and on a box around heterosexuality or lesbian. And so this is that work as an example of kind of queerness. Furthermore, one of the challenges we face is that young people themselves are amazing content creators. And queer youth are pushing the boundaries of how we are and kind of really keeping queerness alive. They're pushing the boundaries of how we understand gender, sexuality, and it's much harder, unfortunately. A lot of the work I do is on TikTok, and it gets better videos, which are much harder to screenshot onto here. So I've given some that I can, but there's so much more out there if you actually get in and start watching the material and watching the content. It's much richer. But you see young people really challenging and this becomes this process where they're questioning and reforming kind of what it means to come out and forcing us to think about, rethink what we mean by gender, the ideas about the notions of binariness of gender that have often been part of a conversation. And similarly, I drew this for a paper really thinking about these videos that I've been watching and thinking about what it means for young people to come out and this kind of transition of communities, right? And how is it that we can help as educators? How can we help if kind of the pre-coming out person has one particular family and social locale and school setting and comes out? As they transition, how does the locale, the family, and the community around them respond and take that up as well? And so this is part of that queer work that I challenge us to continue to think about with young people who are transitioning and coming out and how they're disrupting our senses of community and family. So I'll just end with thinking about what I started with, which is what does it mean to stay with queer as a form of resistance? And first, I just want to remind us that as we talk about doing battle with these policies, which is certainly necessary, it's also necessary to stay with what's been defined as potentially a queer agenda. That in states like New Jersey and California and other states, we have curriculum content, we have people creating curriculum. And we need to take up this and let those lead the way and make that work visible. We need to allow young people to become visible on how they're using social media to maintain queerness. So we need to keep that alive as we then do the work to in these reactionary states. So some examples that I came up with in kind of resistance becomes, what it would mean to actually remove all sexuality and gender talk. So in states like Florida, if you refuse to use mother or father, if we can't say gay, let's not say anything that has to do. Give that a try. See what that does. See how that disrupts the absences that those kinds of conversations create. What does full erasure of gender and sexuality in the curriculum actually look like? And how might that actually be a way of creating conversation amongst young people? We can use queer paradigms like I've done here that really dig into the study of social structures. We can begin to interrogate these assumptions of roles, as I already mentioned. We can continue to read queer authors. I think it's important to remember that authors and historical figures are multidimensional figures. And then also very importantly, because young people, particularly in states where they're targeted, are continuing to use digital spaces, how is it we support digital literacy and safety among students who are using these spaces to find community, to find activist support networks, and to locate themselves? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I see many people are reacting with clapping. I will join. This was fabulous. We have half an hour, and I want to keep at least 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So I'll start with, Sandra, if you don't mind, a couple of questions that were pre-submitted and some of the questions that I prepared. Maybe a quick moment just to set the terminology. We got a question that says the following: as an educator, I'm confused about proper terminology, LGBT, LGBTQ+, cisgender, and then the use of pronouns. Not understanding if I need to be cognizant of all of them or what is the most respectful way to manage a classroom or conversation. He's asking, or she's asking, sorry, what is, if we can set up the language where this diversity may likely exist, and perhaps what do we need to know when we use these labels?
So it's a great question. I love this question. And I think it's actually a really, really difficult question to answer because there isn't I don't know, Warren, you might want to talk about this as well. From my perspective, there's not one set agreed upon language that we use. I tend toward using LGBTQ+. That is my kind of preferred language and thinking about. I also sometimes use queer and I'll define and talk about why I use queer and what for me using queer embodies. And so I think the more important thing, so maybe there's a right language we should agree upon, but for me, the conversation is what is the conversation we have around the language choices we make? So I don't think we're ever going to get the language right in the way that the question's being asked, but I think the question is how are we also talking and having conversations about our choices and decisions about language? Whenever I write papers and I talk, I very specifically mention at the outset, what is it? Why is the language I'm choosing the language I'm choosing, when and why? So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is when I'm talking with students, I listen to students. So my thing when I'm working with young people is I listen to what young people tell me about themselves, and I use that language back with young people. So as young people talk to me in their class and they self-identify, I use that language either globally inclusive in the classroom and specifically then when working with those young people. So I think that's the other part, is very much being kind of listeners and learners in the space. And I think young people are always giving us new language, which I also think is helpful. And again, it comes back to then listening. How are young people giving us new language to talk about?
Thank you, Sandra. So let's start after we establish the importance of language. Can you tell us a little bit, how did you get to work on this kind of research project? What did you do before that led you to this? I'm thinking from a perspective of a colleague, faculty or students who are thinking about engaging with this and they're not sure how to move from what they're doing now to this kind of work. Tell us a little bit about the story.
So for me, the first time I engaged, I took a queer theory class as a graduate student. But the first time that I actually engaged with this work, it was because I was at a conference and I was kind of critical of the heteronormalizing practices that were happening at a conference. And I was very critical of the ways in which certain identities and certain ways of being were being celebrated and given space and others were not. And I think about this a lot in conferences and where we're willing to have where we're willing to have conferences and not have conferences and various things that we do and don't do. But I made a comment and someone said, well, why aren't you doing this research? You're gay. And I said, oh, right, okay. So that the first step is that I was challenged by actually a former colleague at TC, although I was not at TC at the time. But to say, no one's writing about this, why aren't you? And there's problems with that, right? It's the problem is that I'm, assigned to, oh, you're gay, you therefore should write this work. But at the same time, the question is, why wasn't I actually stepping into this work? And if I'm doing critical social studies work, why am I not stepping into this space? And so for me, that became an incentive to do that. My work more recently, I've worked a lot with African immigrant youth and queer youth. And I think that people sometimes struggle to see the connection there. And I think the lives are very different, but the questions of how one becomes visible are relevant and kind of the different ways that one of the challenges in working with queer youth is, particularly in history classrooms or talking with young people about history, is that queer youth are often not raised in households and communities that are queer. And so coming out requires a transition of communities. And it changes them. There's a disruption, there's a disjuncture that we need to attend to as well. And I think that's different than for many other ways that we talk about diversity in diverse communities. There's something different around gender, sexuality, and coming out process and how we are raised in community and find community. And there's overlaps and there's differences, and I think it's worth keeping that in mind. And so for me, there's been similarities with the work with African immigrant youth. So I keep ebbing and flowing back in these works. As also right now, I think there's a calling and the need for work given what's happening in the country.
Yeah, I'm so happy you said you set up this comparison between the two, what seems to be from afar, very two different cases, like because that's one of the challenges I have in my work as well, where people don't understand why you do sustainability and LGBT, like what's the two issues. And I think one of the beautiful things at TC, at Teachers College, is that we can really do this kind of work. Mm-hmm. And develop this kind of bigger picture, or to zoom out and to see the similarities between this movement. So I'm really happy you said that. Which leads me to my next question. Many people do research on LGBT, but it stays in the margin, right? People think that, oh, this is LGBT research. And I want to ask you, What insights does research on LGBT issues offer to the broader field of education? In other words, why does it matter? And let's make the case for more general interest in the topic.
Well, I mean, I think one of the important issues, like I love this question. I think it's a really complicated question. So on the one hand, it matters in and of itself because schools are so fundamentally structured around gender. And we know it's part of the reaction we're getting right now in the quote I gave from Judith Butler is that the ideology that the whole structure of school is founded on a gender binary. And the idea that gender, we have to kind of first of all begin to work, and I do this in my recent work, we can't separate gender and sexuality. They're intimately intertwined. One's gender is deeply intertwined with one's sexuality. And so those ideas that these are independent of one another, we can talk about gender and sexuality. I question the use of the word and rather than gender sexuality. So I think all of this needs to be considered. So I think the first of all, it's important in and of itself because schools themselves are, and education itself is so fundamentally gendered. And so that we need to talk about. And it's not just, I mean, I come from social studies. In my class last night, we were having a great conversation about the sciences and how our very paradigms around gender challenge and force us to then see the world, the natural world, the earth in a very kind of gender capacity. And so it functions, that gendered lens comes through all of the different disciplines that we study in school. So the first thing is I want to kind of say the work in and of itself about disrupting gender is relevant, is fundamental to school and the work we're doing around equity in schooling. It ties into, it has strong intersections with the work on race and how kind of that intersection of gender and race in schools is so fundamental to people's experiences and the structure of inequality and the structure of schools themselves. But more broadly to your question, I think that, you know, there's the ways in which we think about how to, I think for all of the conversations we're having about disrupting dominant narratives and how we find and the tools that we use to disrupt master narratives is super important. And the work we're doing here around gender and sexuality is just one piece of that. And I think that the ways we're finding to think about how does gender work, critique and move forward the work that's already being done in critical social studies and these ideas about what are these literacies of equity look like. So it has places beyond, of course, the work around gender and sexuality.
Wow. I could go more in depth on that question because I think there is so much to unpack with what you said, but in sake of time, and I want to give the audience opportunity to ask us questions as well, maybe we can move to a question. What are the main challenges of doing this kind of research on LGBT issues in education?
So I think the main challenges are partially represented in the work that makes that about getting access to young people while also protecting young people. And then also some of the challenges that we're relating to right now, which is particularly now in this particular political climate. So like in my work with young people right now, like I will not work with young people from Texas, even though my study is nationwide, because the risk that I could ask a non-binary young person to put onto their parents to participate in a research study, the risks are too high. So I specifically won't work with young people in Texas right now, even in a digital platform, because I bring them too many risks. So there's moments like that to consider. So another challenge, of course, is there's so little research actually done with young people, meaning ages of under 18, because we need waivers of consent. And I think we need more research on the more ways to support waivers of consent for youth who are under 18, because the possibility of having to get consent, the coming out process, and it may not be something bad could happen, but young people aren't always ready to come out, or how to articulate that to an adult, we don't always know. And so the idea of this equation, first of all, with the kind of the victim status that we align to young people, we need to kind of disrupt that. And we need to say that that is not the singularity of narratives that define queer youth. We see that in the amazing content that youth are creating. But that becomes part of the challenge of accessing young people. So how do we do that? How do we kind of change the waiver of consent process in order to really allow young people to not have to come out to their family in order to participate? So I think those are, for me, the real challenges, and making sure that people are really supported and safe in being able to share in the work, particularly amongst the acts that we're talking about right now.
Sandra, you mentioned a lot the issues of ethics, IRB, the Institutional Review Board, preventing risk or harm on kids. are there any other challenges? Is there still a stigma in your subfield of people doing this kind of research? Is it being looked down on? I will confess that 10 years ago, I believe in my field in comparative education, that was a no-no. Nobody did it because it was so stigmatized. Is that still the case is that the case in social studies?
Probably. I mean, I noticed that there's always that one session on gender at a conference. There's always in the room, in the basement, in the bottom corner. So I want to say like, no, we value it. But then I think about like where we get located, or we get like the last slot on the conference schedule, which, I think is worth talking about like what that is in terms of representation and status. So I don't think it has this, I don't think it has the same status. There's three of us doing this work. So I certainly doesn't think it has a prevalence that, certainly is a challenge. But yes, of course.
And then funding, is it to get funding to this kind of folk? I'm asking all the questions that a doctoral student would like.
I can't answer that because I'm in the project right now. I mean, I can be honest in this group, right? I'm on the summer group trying to find grants, and I'm searching for money right now because I want to do this policy work. Like I want to have the money to travel to California to sit in these classrooms and see the impact of this curricular work on young people. But I need funding for that, and I haven't yet figured out how to get funding for it. So
okay. When you get the funding, let me know.
I will do.
I'll be happy to celebrate that. Lastly, for my end, and then we'll move to the audience, what are some interesting research questions we should explore in this area moving forward?
Well, I think so. I wrote down a couple of things, and one of the things I'm most interested in and I want to do a lot of is really looking at the work this impact is having on young people. We make these assumptions about the ways in which this work acts on young people. And I mean young people across the board, right? Because we're trying to not only LGBT curricular work is not only trying to support kind of young people who might be at risk somehow in their coming out process, is also to find identity with youth who are supported in their coming out process, but it's also for how do we change the gendered lenses through which everyone is gazing at the world. Mm-hmm. And so the impacts that I'm asking about, there might be different levels of impact, but we want to see like, what is this work actually doing? If we have these kind of queer literacies happening in classrooms, can we get into the classrooms and really study what's happening in the classrooms, how this work is shaping young people? And then this isn't, you said a research, the question, you asked this about what are the research questions. And I don't know that this isn't so much a question, but I think we need to do more with young people. Young people are creating, and I don't know if that changes the way we do research, right? There's something about young people are already content creators, which I think has implications for how we view participation. I mean, young people are already creating knowledge, so it challenges our research methods. That going and interviewing young people who are already content creators kind of belittles the work in the ways they're already part of a knowledge production community. And so I think that's an interesting thing to wrestle with. I don't have the research question attached to it yet, but I think it's something for us to wrestle with as researchers, particularly those of us who are not Gen Z. So what is it like to kind of recognize and build from those forms of knowledge production?
Wow, fantastic. I will just end and say that I find a lot of similarities between what you're doing on LGBT and what we're doing with my team on climate youth activists, that they are producing knowledge, challenging assumptions or discourse around this topic. So at some point, I would love us to think about the comparative study of these two contemporary movements. But I want to go to the audience. I received a couple of questions in the private message, and I have some of the registration questions. I'm encouraging everybody to send me questions. We'll try to cover as many as possible. Sandra, what can educators in conservative states do in their classrooms to add LGBTQ curriculum without the fear of breaking the law?
So it's a really hard question. This question is interesting because I feel like when I was a high school teacher, this was such a question, and then the climate began to change, and now we're back again. And so I think, in some ways the laws are scarier now than they were 20 years ago. And so I think, so one thing is this question was just about what do we do as teachers? Well, one of the things that I mentioned or tried to mention in the presentation is that I think about thinking about queerness rather than LGBT is also productive, because it gives us, maybe we don't infuse direct content. But part of what we're trying to get at in talking about gender and sexuality is we're trying to open these conversations with young people. That gender is not this kind of binary, that gender roles, identities, bodies are disconnected, complex cartographies. So how do we open that space, right? Even if we don't ever use particular languages, how is we open space? What is it? How do we in science classes choose to refuse a binary in terms of how we identify the language around us? When do we ask questions in geography classrooms about the pronouns that we assign to? When do we in language classrooms address the idea about why is it that Western languages have he, she pronouns and many other languages do not? And what does that do about how gender has structured our language and our linguistic systems? So I think there's things that we do, even if we're in a place where we fear kind of, if I say gay, I will lose my job, or these things will happen to me. There's ways in which we kind of constantly include a social critique around gender and sexuality that opens that up without ever saying gay. And I think that's the space to kind of live in that I have the best advice for right now. I have the luxury of not being in a state where that is the case, and slowly trying to work with educators who are in those states. And that for those educators in states who have the 30-day wait period, it is still better to utilize the 30-day wait period than to abandon curriculum altogether. And so states like Tennessee, is that what you're going to ask?
Yeah.
So states like Tennessee have what they call a 30-day wait period and a parental opt-in or parental opt-out. And so you must give parents 30 days to respond to the inclusion of LGBTQ curriculum. So use it. It is awful. It shouldn't be there, but it is there. But I think the one thing we see when we see restrictions like that is we see then we can't do this. And what it says is we actually can. It has restrictions. We should fight those restrictions. But in the meantime, the restriction is aimed to force you to never bring up the content. So if no one ever challenges the policy and actually uses the policy and says, fine, I'll do the 30-day. I'll do it. And I'm going to create this amazing unit on LGBTQ content. And I'm going to have these 4 students opt out, but I'm going to have these students engaged in listening who need it as well.
I didn't know about that option, so this is great.
There's 3 states who have the parental permission.
So it's Tennessee.
I'd have to go back to that map and double check for others. Yeah,
it's okay. We will look at that later. But a related question is, how can school teachers support their students' activism surrounding these issues, which is different than teaching about the issues?
So I need to be careful because this is being recorded, and I'm sure that this can be shared and come back to haunt in terms of inciting. And I think, again, I love these questions, and I hate to always have the answer be like, there's so much variation, right? Like school context matters. And this goes back to the curricular piece as well. The other thing about that is you need to know your school. There's states and there's schools, and there's school and community level involvement, and you need to know your community as well. And it doesn't mean that if you live in a supportive community in an unsupportive state that no one will ever say anything. But the supporting community around it is different than if you're in an unsupportive community in an unsupportive state. And so you need to know that when working with young people as well, because if you're doing things that put yourself and them at risk, there's a different set of actions one needs to take. But generally, I think one of the things that I think is super important, and this comes back to my last remark on the slide, which is we need to talk a lot with young people about digital literacy and how to be safe on digital spaces, because a lot of the activism that young people are engaging in is using those spaces. And so even if we're not directly engaging with them around LGBTQ activism, how is it we're engaging around activist spaces and helping them understand how to use those spaces in smart and thoughtful ways? Because there's also possibilities of how people are taken advantage of, kind of turned in. There's dangers that happen in those spaces, and the way that content can get shared and can bring retribution. And so, we can talk about the algorithms on TikTok and how to utilize them. I mean, there's all sorts of great conversations around digital spaces that we can still be having. And also, I think the most important thing is the ways in which we can try to be visible and to show up for young people. So that means, even if I can't talk about it in school, doesn't mean I can't fight it outside of school. And the young people, and let that be visible, let that be acknowledged as well, because young people need to know that they're not alone in this. This comes back to your climate movement as well. The young people are constantly saying, like, this isn't, in climate change, it's different because it's like, hey, y'all started, y'all are part of the biggest part of the problem. But here, we're all in this together. And so let students know that you're also part of this, this activism.
This is fascinating. I never thought about the digital literacy as an opening for this kind of conversation. Thank you. This is great. I'm going to bring a couple of questions from the chat I received, and I'm inviting everybody to use the minutes we have to send more questions. So this person is saying, I'm curious to know how South American and Caribbean countries navigate issues pertaining to LGBTQ people or issues, specifically Cuba, where education is really a staple in their culture. Any information or sources on these countries that we can learn more about? I'm asking you to wear your comparativist hat for a second.
I do not have I will be honest, I do not have a comparativist hat that engages with Latin America and South America, South America and Central America and the Caribbean. I tend to work on the African continent, and so I do not have a good comparative lens to offer at all.
Is there research in Africa that is happening on this? I know a couple of colleagues that are writing on this. Some of them are TC alumni. But are there any other countries that maybe people can look at from your own reading of the literature?
I mean, I think there's good work in Chile being done around gender. So I know that from a student who's been doing this work. I have a doctoral student whose research was in Chile, and we talk a lot about the work being done in Chile, kind of leading some conversations around gender and sexuality. So that might be a place to turn to. There is, and I have to double check it, but there is a website that I often use in my classes that helps to document policies across countries around the globe, and it looks at a whole range of gender and sexuality related policies. It looks at the history of those policies and continues to update them regularly. I can, if someone leaves me their name, I can send you the link to that website, to that mapping project. I do forget the name of it offhand. I would need to send you the link, but that's a powerful way to trace policies and to kind of look at local culture. They do a great job of keeping it updated and tracing history across kind of, I think there's 11 parameters in which they evaluate policies related to gender and sexuality.
Great. I will follow up and we will add it to the recording of the session for today as a resource. And I'm also sharing with everybody once again the link to the Go Lead database on NGOs that do this kind of work internationally, where you can find more resources. Sandra, if I may, I have one more question for you. How do school administrators who are often not well versed on LGBT inclusiveness set up frameworks and guidelines for teachers to implement these curricular changes? As a gay educator, I often see my straight colleagues and school administrators frustrated and tense about how to implement inclusive practices in the classrooms. Do you have any suggestion about this?
Yeah, the teachers that I work with talk a lot about this. And I think one is that, number one, they're going to make mistakes. And so part of it is, how do we support them? Second, there are some really good, so California, particularly UC Davis, has a center on queer history because of the mandate. And they're doing some really good, they've released some really good work in databases that share information. I have one or two other organizations that have really good curriculum materials and support that I can also add to the list of resources. But I think the first thing is to kind of start with, like, they're going to make mistakes, even if it don't want to feel like this is my job to educate people. Like, sit in that space a little bit and kind of, how can we educate people, let them make mistakes and stumble, and help reaffirm the desire that they want to do to kind of make some change. One of the things that teachers often say is, like, sometimes the administrators are the ones who most need to know from this. And sometimes as they're rooted in their ways, they don't know how to, even with young people, I see administrators do the strangest things related to trans and non-binary students and say the strangest things. And so, educate them, help them realize that they're making it, overthinking and making this harder than it needs to be. I sometimes watch teachers will say to me, like, it's just, if they stop overthinking it and just say, like, it's not that hard. You just do, like, you add this, so it's not that hard. So help them get out of their stumbling blocks and allow them to. I don't know if that quite answers your question. I hope it provides. But I would just, be a model, have resources, have these handouts we can provide, have these handouts and materials to hand off to others and say, like, this is the work being done, help them, give them some idea along the way. For some people, just like I talked about before, one of the things we need to talk about and think about as teachers is that young people are coming out, they're shifting in who their family and their communities are. In the same way we are asking many people, as I said, gender is so rigidly bound in how we think about schooling. We're asking people to disrupt that framework, and they need some support. They don't necessarily in schools where they're being disrupted. And so, we need to engage them in spaces with discourse that help that disruption.
Great. Sandra, thank you so much for all your presentation and for engaging all the questions. For the audience, we are going to collect all these resources that Sandra shared with us, and we'll put them in the link on the website so people can use it later. I want to use my last minute of fame to invite everybody to another event we have on June 30th, where we are going to collaborate with the Teach for All Pride Network, Glaston Research Institute, American University, and our institution to really celebrate Pride internationally in the teaching profession, where we are going to have teachers talking about the work that they do internationally. So for those who are interested in the outside of the US questions, you are more than welcome to join us. I'll ask Juan Carlos to send it to all of the people that RSVP for the event today so you can come. I'll stop here. Thank you again, Sandra, for a wonderful chat. I always enjoy and appreciate the opportunity to engage. Thank you so much. Janice?
All right. Wow, what a deeply engaging and substantive program. I know that I've gained quite an additional lens. I can't thank Oren and Sandra enough. And talking about a supportive community here, we really have two extraordinary faculty here. They obviously extraordinary researchers and teachers, but just extraordinary colleagues, because despite their hectic schedules, they make time for us, they make time for the community. You see them, they're engaged, and it makes such a big difference for us here at the college, for our students and particularly our staff as well as our faculty. So, from the heart, I just wanted to say thank you so much, and that it was powerful and quite timely. The other little thing is we have a couple of small gifts for you, professors. So we want to make sure that you get them, and we are looking forward to the next program. And I just can't thank you enough for always being there when we reach out. So thank you. All right. Enjoy the weekend, enjoy the rest of Pride Month, and don't forget it's Juneteenth on Sunday.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.